question for you to start this off. You've probably never been asked this in a sermon, and you can be honest. Anybody like wine? Anybody? Okay. Good. I'm not a wine expert. I've read quite a bit about wine. I've sampled a few different wines in my life, but I am no expert. I think the process of how they make wine is really interesting. But what do we know about wine? If I want to buy a bottle of wine, if I'm at a restaurant or something, and I've got the choice of a wine from 2021 and a choice of wine from 1980, which one's going to be more expensive? Yeah, the 1980. Why? Because it's aged. And, the older is more expensive because the older wine is better, right? That's what we think, right? Like, if it's the older vintage, it's going to taste better. Man, you're going to get more bang for your buck. It's fermented longer. It's been stored longer. Older is better when it comes to wine. We're going to talk a little bit about wine this morning. Now, let me just say this at the front of this sermon. Alcohol is not evil, all right? Some of us were raised to think that alcohol is evil, and scripturally, it's just not true. Jesus drank wine. Oh, we can breathe. People actually accused Jesus of being a glutton and a drunkard. Like, what's a drunkard? Somebody who drinks alcoholic beverages too much. Like, you're not going to get accused of being a drunkard if you're a teetotaler, right? Like, Jesus is one of the problems they had. Oh, you're a glutton, you're a drunkard, you're hanging out with all these people. No, Jesus drank wine, the disciples drank wine. Wine is involved in Passover. Wine was involved in the Last Supper. And they didn't just drink wine just because the water was bad. And it wasn't just juice. Wine was mostly mixed with water because the alcohol content in the wine was so high. They drank fermented wine. See, having a drink is not a sin for everyone. Now, let me say, having too much to drink is a sin. Drunkenness is a sin. Scripture is clear on that. Don't hear me say that it's not, because there's verse after verse after verse that says that it is. But alcohol in and of itself is not sinful. It's like this. Having money is not a sin, right? Is the love of money sin? Yeah, the love of money is a sin. Alcohol isn't inherently sinful, but the warped love of it is. Because it, like money, can control us. And we're commanded to be controlled by the Spirit and to be sober-minded and all of that. And there's a truth that some people can't handle alcohol, and they should stay away from it completely. Now, but some of our perceptions about alcohol need to change so that they can line up with Scripture. Like, all of our opinions need to be formed by Scripture. Now, if you don't want to drink, don't. That's great. That's perfectly fine. The problem is when we take our own conviction that we don't want to drink, alcohol is bad for us, and we apply it to other people and say it's inherently bad for them too, and it's evil for them, and it's sinful for them. Please do not take your conviction and apply it to everyone across the board and then look down on those people. See, all this has a point. Jesus, he's going to flip our expectations of who he is and what it is that he came to do, and we can either get on board with it, we can get on board with who he is and what he's doing, or we can choose to be offended by it and stick up our nose at it. We talked a little bit about this last week. Jesus is going to use wine as an example to show what he is doing in the world. And wine was a big part of the culture in Israel. I don't know if you know that, but it was. They understood wine. They were experts on wine, on how to make it, how to enjoy it. There were at least 3 different types of wine that they would make depending on the people who were buying it. There's a poor man's wine, which is like all the leftover stuff mixed with water. Like that was the poor man's wine. Like, you don't have any money, that's what's at your dinner table. But there was also, like, they would trot on it with their feet, and they'd gather up the juices, and they would store it, and they'd let it ferment, and they'd drink that. And I mean, that was the good wine. They were experts on wine. But sometimes, when you think you're an expert on something, doesn't matter what it is, like, you don't want to listen to anybody else because you think they have nothing to teach you. Have you met people like this? Yeah? We're not talking so much about wine anymore. But can you relate? Again, it's our pride. You're starting to see a trend in the Gospel of Luke. Jesus is going to attack our pride at every angle because pride is always the enemy of a righteousness by faith. If you've got a Bible, go ahead and crack it open to Luke 5, around verse 33. It'll be on the screen. If you don't have a Bible, use your phone, or there's probably one in the pew in front of you. So I want to introduce the text this morning, then I want to talk about a related text, and then I want to come back to the original text. So that's our game plan this morning. And hopefully by the end of our time together, we'll all understand just a little bit better what Jesus was talking about, because if we're honest, it's a little bit foreign and confusing to our modern ears, at least it is to mine. So Luke chapter 5, starting in verse 33, says, "And they came to him, and they said to him, 'The disciples of John fast often and offer prayers, and so do the disciples of the Pharisees. But yours eat and drink.' And Jesus said to them, 'Can you make wedding guests fast while the bridegroom's with them? The days will come when the bridegroom is taken away from them, and then they will fast in those days.' He also told them a parable. 'No one tears a piece from a new garment and puts it on an old garment. If he does, he will tear the new, and the piece from the new will not match the old. And no one puts new wine into old wineskins. If he does, the new wine will burst the skins, and it will be spilled, and the skins will be destroyed. But new wine must be put into fresh wineskin.'" It's like, whoa! What's all this talk about? Sewing pieces of new cloth and old cloth and wineskins? What in the world is a wineskin anyway? Like, what in the world is going on here? Man, this passage, I'd read it. It used to confuse the daylights out of me. Like, I have no idea what he was talking about, and I just scratched my head. Now, thankfully, I want you to know it's a lot easier to understand than I made it out to be all those years. And it's a little mind-blowing when you actually realize just what Jesus is saying here. Now, here's the scene we need to see right now before we see anything else. Some religious leaders, they come up to Jesus, and they basically say, "Jesus, you're not doing things the way that we think you should do them. Like, in other words, Jesus, you don't match our expectations for what we think you should be doing. Like, we didn't really like John the Baptist all that much, he called us this brood of vipers, told us that judgment was at the door, that the axe was even at the foot of the tree, and we really didn't appreciate that, but at least his disciples fasted a lot. And at least his disciples, they prayed a lot. Just like the Pharisees do, by the way, Jesus. But Jesus, here's the deal. Here's our problem. We don't ever see your disciples fasting in public, and we don't ever see your disciples making these big lengthy prayers in public. Therefore, we don't think you're that worthy to be listened to as this great teacher. If you were such a great teacher and such a great rabbi, your disciples would at least be doing those things that we could see." Now, do you notice how everything that they mentioned to Jesus was outward? Like, they listed behaviors that could be seen by other people. Like, we can see outward behaviors, right? Like, it's not hard. But we can't see what's going on the inside. But as it seems to keep coming back time after time throughout this gospel, it is so easy for us to just focus on outward behaviors. Because then we can kind of make this checklist of all the things that we've done, and conversely, all the things that we haven't done, right? And others can make these checklists, and we can use these checklists to kind of quantify everything that we've done, that we haven't done, and we can make ourselves look pretty good, at least in our own eyes. Now, Jesus, he said some pretty interesting things in the Sermon on the Mount. Like, we spent much of last year just unpacking the Beatitudes, which opened up that sermon. But listen to these words, especially just after just hearing what the religious leaders said to Jesus. Matthew 6, 1-4, Jesus says, "Beware of practicing your righteousness before other people in order to be seen by them. For then you will have no reward from your Father who's in heaven. Thus, when you give to the needy, sound no trumpet before you, as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and in the streets, that they may be praised by others. Truly, I say to you, they have received their reward. But when you give to the needy, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, so that your giving may be in secret, and your Father who sees in secret will reward you. So we've got giving here. It talks about giving publicly. Then you go on to verse 5. It says, when you pray, you must not be like the hypocrites, for they love to stand and pray in the synagogues and at the street corners, that they may be seen by others. Truly, I say to you, they have received their reward. But when you pray, go into your room and shut the door and pray to your Father who's in secret, and your Father who sees in secret will reward you. And when you pray, do not heap up empty phrases as the Gentiles do, for they think that they'll be heard for their many words. Do not be like them, for your Father knows what you need before you ask Him. So we got giving, we've got praying, and finally, in Matthew 6:16, He says, and when you fast, not if, but when, do not look gloomy like the hypocrites, for they disfigure their faces, that their fasting may be seen by others. Truly, I say to you, they have received their reward. But when you fast, anoint your head and wash your face, that your fasting may not be seen by others, but by your Father who's in secret. And your Father who sees in secret will reward you. Jesus isn't concerned with our outward religious actions, which are done to make us look good and pious in front of other people. He's concerned with what other people can't see, which only He can see. So hypocrites, as Jesus called them, including the Pharisees, they would do everything loudly and proudly and publicly so that they would be seen by others, so others would praise them. Oh, look at how holy they are. Man, listen to how beautiful their prayers are. I have never heard words like that in a prayer. My prayers don't sound anything like that. If only I could pray like that. My goodness. And look how often they fast. Like, I can't even skip a meal without feeling sick. Man, if I could only be like these people. And then Jesus said something shocking. He said they'd already received their reward in full. What was their reward? That was their reward. Their little hand clap there. Their earthly praise and recognition. Like there'd be no heavenly reward because they'd received their reward in full on the earth. And if you have ears to hear what Jesus is saying there. It's not about what you could ever do on the outside to make you appear religious or righteous. It's about only what God can do on the inside of you to make you a child of God. See, the religious leaders, they complained that Jesus' disciples didn't look or act like they thought they should. They were the experts, by the way. Like, they didn't go around looking sad all the time. They didn't go around letting everybody know how holy they were. In fact, man, if I didn't know better, they seemed happy and they seemed joyful and they seemed excited and full of life. It's like, you can't be happy and follow God. That's nonsense. That's basically what these religious leaders are implying here. So Jesus tells them, if you're at a wedding, the wedding guests, they're gonna celebrate while the groom is there, right? Like, it's not a time for sadness, it's a time for celebration. It's a wedding. You've got the groom with you. But if the groom gets taken away, then there will be a time of sadness because he's not there anymore. Jesus, they don't know it, but He's given them a glimpse of the cross. When the groom will be taken away from them, now remember, the cross wasn't random. It certainly wasn't a surprise to Jesus, at least not at this point in His ministry. He knew it was looming in the distance. He knew it was the whole reason why He came to the earth. And He knew what His death on that cross, followed by His resurrection from the dead, would accomplish. But it's hard to teach people anything when they already think they know everything. The hardest person there is to teach is the person who already believes they know what you're trying to teach them. And the hardest person to reach for Christ is the person who's already convinced they know Him because of all the things they've done for Him. This is the very thrust of Jesus' parable about the new clothes and the new wineskins. He's talking to a group of religious leaders who were so convinced that they already knew God because of all of their external religious activities. But Jesus, he's inaugurating a completely different kind of kingdom. He was doing something brand new, planned from the beginning of time, even prophesied by Isaiah the prophet, who prophesied in Isaiah chapter 43, verse 18. He says, "Remember not the former things, nor consider the things of old. Behold, I am doing a new thing. Now it springs forth. Do you not perceive it? The wild beasts will honor me, the jackals and the ostriches, for I give water in the wilderness, rivers in the desert, to give drink to my chosen people, the people whom I formed for myself, that they might declare my praise." And when God does a new thing, when God does a new thing, church, whatever it is, we need to get on board with it instead of hanging on to the old and the familiar and the comfortable. This is precisely why Jesus turned the water into wine in John chapter 2. We sang about it. And we don't talk about that passage a whole lot. And in a lot of places when they do, they want to go out of their way to say it was a non-alcoholic wine, which is just silly. Like, we have to let the text speak for itself, whether we're comfortable with the text or not. And there's a detail in the text that we often miss because our culture is completely different. And here's what it says, John chapter 2, verse 6. It says, "Now there were 6 stone water jars there for the Jewish rites of purification, each holding 20 to 30 gallons. Jesus said to the servants, 'Fill the jars with water.' And they filled them up to the brim. And he said to them, 'Now draw some out and take it to the master of the feast.' So they took it. When the master of the feast tasted the water now become wine and did not know where it come from, though the servants who had drank the water knew, or who had drawn the water knew, the master of the feast called the bridegroom and said to him, 'Everyone serves the good wine first, and when the people have drunk freely, then the poor wine. But you have kept the good wine until now.' This, the first of his signs, Jesus did at Cana in Galilee and manifested his glory, and his disciples believed in him." Why mention the water jars? Well, why mention these huge 6 stone water jars that were used for purification? Just picture this. These huge jars, these were the jars that the Jews used to purify themselves and to do their ritual washings. These were the jars that they used to make themselves clean, right? They symbolized the old traditions and the way things had always been done. They symbolized comfort and familiarity. In many ways, they were like that clock on the wall over there. What's so special about that clock? Anybody? It's always been there. Where'd it come from? The old church? Okay. What would happen if that clock fell and broke into several pieces? You wouldn't have a clock? Yeah. I promise the church would still go on. If it broke and it shattered into 100 pieces and we had to sweep it up after church, this church would still go on. I promise. But that clock, some of us might freak out. It's like that clock hung in our church. It was in our old church. It's been there for 100 years. That clock reminds us of our past. How dare you talk about it not being here? But sometimes the clocks need to break. Or what if we didn't sing a hymn in here for more than 2 weeks in a row? What if all the songs that we sang in here from here on out were 20 years old or less? No, those hymns make us comfortable. Those hymns remind us of our childhood. We sang those hymns in the old building. See, some of you might be getting a little upset. That's okay. That's the point. Can you see how sometimes we get stuck in the past? Jesus' audience got super mad at him when he challenged their pride, when he challenged their comfort, when he challenged their traditions, when he confronted their religiosity. Jesus took those water jars, those symbols of the past, and he did something incredible. Jesus, he had them fill the old jars all the way up to the top, and then he miraculously changed the nature of the water. Like he turned the water into wine, and not just any wine, but good wine. Why? Because he was doing a new thing. And the new thing was going to be so much better than the old thing. Like that's part of the point of what the master of the feast was saying. Usually it's the best wine at first, and then when everybody's drunk it, then they give you the inferior wine, the cheap wine, the poor man's wine. But he says, Jesus, you've given the best wine last. And this last wine is so much better than the wine we had at first. But could you imagine if there'd been a bunch of people behind the scenes before he'd done that? And they saw him around the water jars. They saw him messing with that. You can't put wine in these jars, Jesus. You can't do that. These jars are pure water. We've had these jars for hundreds of years. It's never held anything unclean in it. You can't put wine in here. But after the master of the banquet drank the new wine, he couldn't help but admit that the new wine was so much better than what he'd earlier tasted. Hang on to that. We can't get so hung up on the past that we can't see what God's doing in the present and what he wants to do in the future. Now, in saying that, let's go back to our original text here, and let's reread part of it. Starting in Luke 5:35. He says, the days will come when the bridegroom is taken away from them, and they will fast in those days. He also told them a parable. No one tears a piece from a new garment and puts it on an old garment. If he does, he will tear the new, and the piece from the new will not match the old. And no one puts new wine into old wineskins. If he does, the new wine will burst the skins, and it will be spilled, and the skins will be destroyed. But new wine must be put into fresh wineskins. Now, the two examples that he uses in this parable are saying the exact same thing. The first example, the new cloth going on the old, just goes to show you can't combine new cloth with old cloth. When you wash it, it's going to shrink, and it'll end up actually making the tear worse. His main point is that the two are incompatible together. They don't fit together. Now, the wineskins are probably easier for us to understand what Jesus is saying. Could you throw up that picture, Amanda? That is a wineskin. In case you're wondering, and you're reading this, and we're a couple thousand years separated from this, it's like, what in the world is a wineskin? That's a wineskin. They use animal hide, and they would store their wine in that. But who knows what happens when you put wine in a container? Like when you're making wine. Does anybody know? Like what does wine do? It ferments. What's it do when it ferments? Like what do the gases do? Yeah, it expands. All these gases, they expand. So they had to have something to put wine in when they were making it. And if you put new wine, right, wine that's expanding still, wine that's fermenting still, wine that's still letting off gas, like if you put new wine into old wineskins, the old skins are going to break because they've lost all of their elasticity. They can't fit anymore. And then the wine's ruined and the skin is ruined and you're having a bad day. New wine is incompatible with old wineskins because it just can't work with it. They're not compatible. Can you start to understand a little bit about what Jesus is saying here? He is the new wine, and the traditions of the past are the old wineskins. And Jesus, in all that he is doing, and this kingdom that he's inaugurating, they don't mix. Jesus cannot be contained in old wineskins. He's new wine. And the new kingdom that he's inaugurating isn't compatible with the old way of doing things. The new covenant isn't compatible with the old covenant. And not only are they not compatible with each other, as was shown by the wine at the wedding, but the new is better. The new is superior. Take this back to the beginning for just a second, but what do we usually know about wine? Is it that do we know that the new wine is usually better than old wine? Like, do you want a 2021 over a 1980? No. The old is usually preferable, right? For all kinds of reasons. And even Jesus knows this, which is why verse 39 is here. We haven't read it yet. Luke 5:39. Remember, Jesus is talking to the religious leaders. He says, "And no one, after drinking old wine, desires new. For he says the old is good." Now, he's making an ironic statement here. The Pharisees and the religious leaders don't want anything to do with the new wine, even though it's so much better in every way, because they are happy with the way things have always been. They're happy with the way things are. They're comfortable. They're happy being seen out in public, acting out their religion for everyone to see. They're comfortable with their works-based faith to where they can at least think they know where they stand because they did all these things or they didn't do all these things. They want nothing to do with the new because they're happy with the old. Now, don't make the mistake of thinking that Jesus was only talking to the Pharisees here. Now, he's talking to us too. Like wine, what Jesus does and the kingdom that he brings, it's going to expand all over the place. And it's going to expand to some really surprising places. It's going to expand to Gentiles, which is going to be a shock to the Jews, even though it was all prophesied in the Old Testament. Like we get to see this in the Gospels, especially we see this in the book of Acts. We need to be willing to taste and to drink the new wine of Christ. And new wine has to have new wineskins, new worldviews, new expectations. So here's my encouragement to you. Throw out your old wineskins and pray for God to give you new wineskins. The kingdom will expand in some unpredictable ways, ever outward. And it'll burst your old wineskins of tradition and religion. And if we can't get with the picture, we're going to end up spilling all over the place. Ask God to give you new wineskins. And man, be ready when he does. And when he does give you new wineskins, get out of the way. Don't let your expectations of who Jesus is and what he will do get in the way to where you cannot see the big picture of what he's doing. Let's pray. God.